Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Bonnie Clearwater and the NSU Museum staff for having me here today. I am pleased to be with you and so happy that you came out on this Memorial Day weekend when you could have been at the beach. And I just feel truly blessed that we are, with everything that's going on in the world, that we are taking this time and this space, this hour, to talk about art and art as resistance. So I wanted to go back to not only the description of my talk today, but as Lisa was mentioning, a lot of my work is on the narratives, the written narratives and visual narratives of Black women's wellness. So their journeys, their cognitive development, how they make meaning of their lives, how they name themselves, and how they create agency for not only themselves, but for their families and their communities. And so my lens is what we call Africana womanism. So it's not just, for example, Black feminist thought, right? The idea is that there's a long lineage of Black women who think not only in terms of their own gendered experience, but also that of Black men and Black families, Black children, right? And all that goes into that. So I started off asking a few questions about the women the Black women in this exhibit. And going back to the description, I was asking what stories are Black women artists telling about the interior lives of Black women? What light and truth are they illuminating against the dominant narrative of Black women's lived experience? And a part of that is this idea that these artists are talking back to the dominant narrative, the stereotypes about Black women, but that they're also experiencing a triple consciousness. So W.E.B Dubois talks about double consciousness, where Black people are very concerned and have to learn and know their own culture and their own histories, right? And also that of the dominant society. And so Black women have one more layer to that, right? Where they are also experiencing gendered racism and having an experience that's separate and apart from Black men. So I wanted to talk about how these artists are having that conversation. And I wanted to start with, I was having a conversation with one of my graduate students, and she was jogging my memory. We were talking about Audre Lorde and Sister Outsider. And so I just want to read a little excerpt from her because as you can see from the title, right, she feels like she's on the periphery. She feels like she is an outsider, even though she is an American, right? And so where does all of that come from, and what do we do with it all? So I'm gonna read just an excerpt from Sister Outsider to frame what we're gonna talk about in our walking tour today. I hope everybody has on comfy shoes. So I'm starting in an essay called Eye to Eye, Black Women, Hatred, and Anger. And so this is about intracultural conversations that Black women have with other Black women, okay? So again, that triple consciousness, right? Everybody with me? You tracking with me? Okay. All right. She says, when I started to write about the intensity of the angers between Black women, critical aspects between Black women, I found I had only begun to touch one tip of a three-pronged iceberg, the deepest understructure of which was hatred, that societal death wish directed against us from the moment we were born Black and female in America. From that moment on, we have been steeped in hatred for our color, for our sex, for our effrontery in daring to presume we had any right to live. As children, we absorb that hatred, passed it through ourselves, and for the most part, we still live our lives outside of the recognition of what that hatred really is and how it functions. Echoes of it return as cruelty and anger in our own dealings with each other. For each of us bears the face that hatred seeks, and we have each learned to be at home with cruelty because we have survived so much of it within our own lives. And so she starts to talk about how we dismantle this hatred. And she says, to search for power within myself means I must be willing to move through being afraid to whatever lies beyond. If I look at my most vulnerable places and acknowledge the pain I have felt, I can remove the source of that pain from my enemy's arsenals. My history cannot be used to feather my enemy's arrows then, and that lessens their power over me. Nothing I accept about myself can be used against me to diminish me. I am who I am, doing what I came to do, acting upon you like a drug or a chisel to remind you of your meanness as I discover you in myself. America's measurement of me has lain like a barrier across the realization of my own powers. It was a barrier which I had to examine and dismantle, piece by painful piece, in order to use my energies fully and creatively. It is easier to deal with the external manifestations of racism and sexism than it is to deal with the results of those distortions internalized within our own consciousness of ourselves and one another. So that is triple consciousness, right? This idea that you are dealing with being an American or being some other nationality, right? That you are Black and that you are woman, and that you are struggling with these conversations or navigating these different environments outside and inside. So, speaking of movements, I want to start with Turquoise Dyson. So this is I Belong to the Distance, and it is homage to Henry Box Brown. So does anybody know who Henry Box Brown is? Yes, he emancipated himself, thank you, by putting himself in creating a box, a 3x2, I think, wooden crate, right, to ship himself from Virginia to Philadelphia, 27 hours. Does anybody know anything about his family? Did you read anything about his family or hear anything about his family, his wife, his children? So the impetus for getting in the box was that he not just couldn't take slavery anymore, but that his pregnant wife and 3 children were sold to another plantation. And at some point he was able to pay a ransom, and then they sold the family permanently away. So he was paying this ransom to keep them, close, and then they went away. And so he wrote 2 autobiographies about the pain of that, the agony of that, and how he thought he would live the rest of his life, right, desolate and alone. But he didn't. He created a box and put himself in it, right, and shipped himself. And so Turquoise Dyson is really interested in the ways in which, in search of Black liberation, Black folks tap into their own ingenuity, right, and create movement, create migration, right? But also the idea of, or when enslaved Africans were forced across, right, the Atlantic Ocean and so on and so forth. So, so we have these architectural structures, right, that resemble the box. Henry Box Brown decided to go on after he escaped from freedom. He did get married, and he decided to create an identity out of this situation. So he literally became the box, Henry Box Brown, right? And he would perform magic shows, right, with disappearing handkerchiefs and watches, right? And so he became a celebrity in a way, right? Traveling around Europe and the United States. But a lot of theorists say, well, he never really escaped the box, did he? Because his entire identity was attached to that box. So this is homage to him. But Turquoise Dyson has this whole series of living in the distance. And this idea of time travel, and this idea of hyper-colonialism, overuse of the land, abuse of the people, and what their reaction is to that abuse, right? This idea of the Plantationocene. So some theorists say that climate change really started during the plantation era, right? When we were abusing the earth and really abusing, and so we've kept doing that, right? Even though we have gotten past slavery in America. So she's really interested in how enslaved Africans of that time were using their ingenuity to migrate, what they were doing with the land side by side what the masters were doing on the plantation. So if you've ever gone to a plantation, you might have seen outside of the quarters, the slaves had their own farmland that they were working, their own little garden, and how they treated the land much differently than the land was being used on the plantation. And so as we move forward and deal with climate change, Turquoise Dyson is asking us to also consider the history of the plantation, right, and the abuse of people and power, and use that moving forward as we start to come up with solutions for climate change. And she believes that some of those solutions might be found in ancient African practices as well. Can everybody hear me? You can hear me okay? All right. All right, so we have Inda Jaka Crosby here. And she blends painting and collage, photo transfers, imagery of family photos. She keeps a lot of family photos and uses those family photos to create her paintings, her collage work. And oftentimes the imagery is of families sitting together, conversing, eating at the table, connecting some way, embracing. And this particular piece, The Thing Around My Neck, is of her embracing her white American husband. And so she's really interested in the idea of having multiple identities simultaneously, right? That she is a Nigerian living in America, married to a white American man, right? And oftentimes you'll see, for example, you might see a woman who maybe has a rural hairstyle, but a very modern dress, and there's a vintage TV in the background, right? So to display the ways in which people have these multiple identities. And you see she also uses fabric and tradition. So she's very interested in the ways that we carry on traditions, but also how we add to them. I think this is something that's really interesting and true across the African diaspora. I talked about this last year in the Afrofuturistic conversation for Juneteenth. But if you look at her dress, she often uses these photo prints from Nigeria. So it's photographs on Ankara print, and the one that she uses here and a couple of other of her works are of her mother's senatorial race. And you might remember them from like when Obama was running. We saw a lot of those prints. But she's interested in how we use those traditional prints, those traditional Ankara prints, and then add to them, right? A sort of remixing, if you will, of the print. So again, these multiple identities, and again, movement, right, back and forth between the identities. Her work speaks a lot to, she makes a lot of different literary references as well. So even the title, The Thing Around My Neck, is in reference to Chimamanda Adichie's work, The Thing Around Your Neck, when she talks about, you guys recognize that, right? When she talks about being Nigerian in America, right? And so she talks about the fact that sometimes you can't maybe see that in her work, and so she'll play with the title, right? So that, she is making that reference. Chinua Achebe, Things Fall Apart, is another literary reference that she often draws from and speaks back to. And so you guys are familiar with Chinua Achebe, Things Fall Apart? So it's the story of what happens when the colonizers reach West Africa, right? And how that changes the society, and what do you do with all of this? How do you make sense of all of it, right? And what's interesting about that is he is speaking back to the dominant culture, but using the colonizer's language. And so that's very interesting to her too, because he's very much centered in, you know, this West African culture, but using the colonizer's language. And so there are these multiple identities that these writers are constantly working with. Shoshanna Weinberger talks about the fact that she's often on the periphery of several different identities, so that she's not Jamaican enough, right? She's not American enough. And so she feels like going back to Sister Outsider, right? That makes her feel not American enough, making her feel like she's on the outside. Her work also kind of speaks back to other literary works and references like Nella Larson. Some of you might be familiar with Nella Larson's passing. It became very popular recently, it became a Netflix series, or movie I should say. But there's this, some would say tragic mulatto, but others would say that she uses the trope of the trickster mulatto, that the mulatto is moving in and out of these spaces, passing for white on the one hand, but code switching, passing for white, you know, in order to have certain advantages, privileges, power, right? But code switching on the other hand, when she's or he is are among other Black folks. And code switching is something that anyone who is of color has to deal with in certain space. Here I'm speaking American Standard English so everybody can understand me. When I go home, I might have some other dialects, right? So she's very interested in those types of literary references and shape shifting and that racial ambiguity, because she feels as though that's a part of her. She makes some reference to Strange Fruit, the song Strange Fruit, but that it was written by a Jewish poet. And so that she feels that she's a part of those two identities, and that keeps her, that she is the strange fruit that kind of keeps her on the periphery. She's also interested in, as you can see here, these forms, the Black body and the history of Black women being on display, being exploited, and commodified. So we have these Black bodies, right, that are wrapped in gold, right, gold chains to represent the commodification. And so a lot of her works kind of harkens back and speaks back to Sarah Bartman. You might know her as Hottentot Venus, where she was brought from South Africa to be put on display for her backside, for her behind, and people profited off of that. And how that has carried on throughout history. But also that Black women's bodies are often deemed too much, too rowdy a spectacle, right? Think of Michelle Obama in the White House, all them arms, put those arms away, right? Serena Williams on the tennis court, Black bodies in yoga studios. No. We need subtle, angular, flat bodies, not round bodies. And so her work speaks to the idea of Black women being very cognizant of when they step outside of their house and their bodies are in certain spaces, what that means for them and what that means for other people, right? So she plays with this idea of the grotesque and the beautiful, right? So none of these, clearly they're bodies, but they don't have any heads. Right? So we have Leslie Hewitt, and it's interesting that she's next to William Cordova because they've spent so many years collaborating. And her work is minimalist in a sense, but it's very layered, right? She often speaks to the influence of the photojournalism of the 1960s, of Malcolm X and so on and so forth, and how looking at those pictures, those photographs, has such an imprint on her, even though she did not experience it physically, but that she calls it post-memory, but that she carries it with her. And what I think is really interesting about that is I think that a lot of I would say African Americans, for example, in this country live with that post-memory. My father was from Mississippi. He just passed away this year, God bless him. But I grew up with those tales, right, of the South and of Mississippi. And so even though I didn't experience it in the 40s and 50s as he did, it lived in the home, right, and it created an imprint on me. And so she talks about that kind of imprint that it made on her. And so she often layers her work with little pieces of that photojournalism. So even though what you might think you are seeing are these domestic interiors, she layers them with pieces of that photojournalism. And she's also influenced by 16th and 17th century Dutch still life, and the idea that when you look at those photographs, you're seeing this, cornucopia, this tableau of, sugar and pepper and grapes and this, that, and the other thing. But she's interested in how did all of those things get there, right? And of course, 16th century, we're talking about slavery. That's how it got there. But you're not shown that picture. You're only shown that tight, you're not shown what's on the outside, right, of that picture. Just what they want you to see in terms of their privilege. And so she feels as though her works are connected to that her works and her photos are still engaging with that history. And she asks us to look beyond the meanings that we're presented with on the surface and to look at some of those layers. I think she's also influenced by cinema and film. Yeah. And so her images are often arranged that way. Yeah. Okay, so here we have Lauren Holland, and she has this very picturesque, misty, woodsy images, but her images of these black and brown bodies make reference to the fact that black and brown women are often not thought of as classic beauty and are thought to be easily discarded or even trash, which is why she has, if you look, I know you probably can't see from where you are, and I'll move at some point so that you can come and take a closer look, but you can see that there are these pieces of trash. So if you come out, you see, they're very beautiful and they're in the woods and, right, very picturesque. But if you come a little closer, you start to see the trash that's around them. And so there's a lot of symbolism there about what other people think about you and the images that people portray of you and how that has power over you and over your body. We can think about Trayvon Martin. We can think about Ahmaud Arbery. And she is also interested in black male bodies and how black male bodies are often thought of as disposable, animalistic. Here we have Abigail Deville. She's always looking at the construction and the reconstruction of ideas around freedom and the iconography that we have around those ideas. She says that the ancient Greeks were looking at the Egyptians, Americans were looking at Rome and Greece, so that there's always this long look back to push a certain narrative to the forefront, and that we're always surrounded by these public structures. One of the structures that she talks about a lot in terms of liberty is the Statue of Liberty, Veritas, and how it represents for many white immigrants, right, this idea of freedom and hope, and that for Black Americans, it doesn't have that same sense, that they're not as attached to it, and that the original sculptor wanted to give that gift as a representation of the end of slavery. There are chains underneath, right, the feet of Libertas. And so that was the original intent, and that the American government was saying, no, we're past that now, And W.E.B Dubois even spoke about sailing past on his way, going back to double consciousness, sailing past Libertas, sailing past the Statue of Liberty on his way from England back to the United States, and seeing that statue, but for him thinking that he still had no connection to it, right? That for him, freedom, equality, justice were not things that were realized for the Black community, and that there was this big disconnect. So she often asked us to think about, you know, how many of these sculptures exist in public places where, you know, the message is for you to think about your government in a certain way. And is that the way that it really is? And I think after George Floyd, we've seen a lot of folks grapple with that, right? And some of the public images that we've begun to dismantle. But she often moves through, again, a lot of these artists, right, are moving through space and time and collapsing time. And again, she's thinking about, so where do we take this in the future? But she literally, right, collapses them. All right, so here we have Micheline Thomas, and she unapologetically talks about how her work is the Black woman's gaze on the beauty of Black women. She was very much influenced by her own mother, who was a model, and images of Black women as a gay woman and looking at the beauty in them and seeing her reflection of her own beauty. So those are some of the influences, and another big influence of hers is Jet magazine. So back in the day, as they say, Jet magazine used to come out weekly. It was for those of you not familiar with it, it was a digest size weekly magazine that was published in Chicago by the Ebony Publishing Company. And so on the cover, you might see Michael Jackson, Aretha Franklin, right? And all the latest news and gossip of what was going on in the Black community. But somewhere in there was, and from the men I'm told, it was always on page 43. I don't know what page it was, but I do remember the beauty of the week. And so every week there was a beauty of the week who usually had on a one-piece or a two-piece bathing suit, and there was a little at the bottom of the photo, some information about maybe where she went to school, perhaps at HBCU, right? Her hobbies, riding horses or whatever, right? But her professional interests as well. And whereas a lot of people thought that that was objectification and exploitation of Black women, others felt, and I have the sense that Micheline feels that way, that this was the Black women's body coming into the mainstream, right? Black women were not on Vogue and Glamour and Life. We're hardly on any of those magazines now. In fact, you know, a lot of them say if they put a Black woman on the cover, their sales go down. So they do not put Black women on those covers a lot of times. But that it brought Black beauty into the mainstream, and also normalized Black women, right, and our beauty. Wangechi, some of you might remember her watercolor work, her collage and watercolor work that she first did that were based on media images and materials. So there was this influence of the idea that, again, that white women's bodies, right, and white beauty was the standard for beauty, right? And that she noticed that if Black women were included in any of these high fashion magazines, right, that it was often problematic. And so her initial intent was to sort of vandalize that material and to create a new narrative, something more dignified for her. So that's how she started, and it's interesting for me that she talks about how she always sort of wanted to get into other works, like, you know, the sculptural work that you see here. A lot of her influence comes from when she was growing up in Kenya, going to an all-girls Catholic school, surrounded by women. So that was one influence. But another one was the narrative that she got while she was growing up. And that narrative, because Kenya is such a Christianized, colonized society, was that there was one creation story, that there was only one history, that they weren't being taught about their own African histories and culture. Even growing up in the US, I can tell you that was my experience. There was one little paragraph on slavery. So for her, when she started to make art, she wanted to speak back to that dominant narrative. That there couldn't be, for her, these were things that she was grappling with, that there couldn't be one singular story. And so she thought that was quite fictional, right? There's no way that we're living in this African country, but all we're learning about is European religion and history. One other influence that I'll mention is her time outside in the garden, and so you can see that kind of represented here, right? But she grew up spending a lot of time looking at organisms, and she had this idea that earth and nature was very sacred. And so I'll start with this piece here that I call it Eshu, but she calls it Seeing Cowries. And this work has been obviously exhibited in other museums and shows, and so it's really interesting for her when she sees this particular piece placed with other quote-unquote holy relics, right, or religious relics, and how those religious relics are deemed more holy, let's say, than this. And so I've seen some reviewers say that, oh, this is very much representative of Buddha, Ganesh, but I call it Eshu because in West African tradition, Eshu or Ilegba or Ilegwa in Santeria is made out of this kind of earthen mound, and always with the cowrie shell eyes, surrounded by cowrie shells. Cowrie shells were used as currency, but also as divination. So also as a guiding post for how you live your life, right? So we have this one piece that's attached to some other West African cultures and creation stories. We also have the original 9 daughters. There's some other pieces back there. And so everyone in Kenya traces their lineage back to these 9 women. And in fact, Wangechi's name her name is from one of those women, Wangeci. So again, this idea that, well, it wasn't just Adam and Eve, right, or the pictures that we got growing up of this white Adam and Eve. She knew her culture and her history, that there was another story here, and she wanted to speak back, you know, with that story. Right behind you, I believe there's mirror face 1, mirror face 2, and mirror face 3. And so the third one that's missing is draped in red, right? And so we have black, yellow, red, the Black national flag. We have these images that you can see they are referencing scarification and plates, right? That would be very similar to what happens in her culture, what she has seen. And so the mirrors are also facing up at the ceiling, facing down, facing the audience, for us to think about our own beauty and our ideas, challenging those ideas of what Western beauty is, right? And African beauty, right? And that dominant narrative that Western beauty is the standard. Yeah. To your right is the Sentinel-6, I believe. And again, this idea that the earth is sacred, and her love of organisms. But this particular piece is, for her, representative of the divine, of the feminine divine, and particularly the Black feminine divine. But when she sculpted it, it looks as though it's guarding her, guarding us, guarding the earth. And so it looks like very much like a warrior. And so she named it Sentinel. And I suppose we'll leave you with the cave call if people want to stay. And it's a very meditative, I kind of went into like a little meditation when I watched it. But again, going back to this idea of the creation story and the stories we tell and whose story we prioritize, right? And the earth and the sacredness of it, which I think is really interesting that when you turn the corner, you get back to Turquoise, right? Going back to that idea of, climate change and things of that nature. But yeah, I would encourage everyone to stay and to watch this piece because I think it pulls everything that we've talked about here together quite nicely. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.